picking up immediately where the previous installment had left off, as the first initial push of two into the Albuquerque International Airport, or essentially the Albuquerque Sunport as it's called, had effectively been undertaken in an extremely delicate and surgical manner, with heavy weapons usage having to be sanctioned by higher command as it pertained to Iranian forces calling for their usage as it pertained to artillery and air power from coalition air forces, as well as even missile forces from the coalition forces, as the Iranian forces had, by 8:15, successfully secured the peripheral areas of the airport grounds, as it were, including all of the shipping companies, the parcel companies, and shopping companies, effectively, which all had offices and warehouses in this area. They now were poised to take what was even left of the airport, as in the main terminal buildings, as well as also the runway, completely intact. As it pertained to the taxiways, however, there would be a limited sanctioned usage of some Iranian artillery firepower, as well as even on the outer edges of the runway, some extremely precise strikes from returning JF-17Bs of the coalition air power, specifically earmarked for just this one specific battlefield alone, or area of operations, or AO, or battle space, as the JF-17Bs were effectively a Chinese aircraft that now Pakistan was even building by license. They could utilize the Baidu-guided weapon systems, essentially the Chinese satellite-guided systems, and would utilize these in an extremely precise manner, hitting immediately off the runways, but in such a way to where it would destroy fleeing American vehicles trying to flee towards the airport grounds, effectively from the outermost fencing, as they had been securing the perimeter for their forces within the buildings, and now were on the retreat throughout the area, as a 30-minute pause had been taken effectively after the battle just to the north of the airport proper, as to view the International Sunport or airport area. The peripheral areas surrounding the International Sunport, effectively what's on this map and beyond in all directions, were the parcel and other corporate structures and offices, such as their warehouses and other supporting infrastructure, and these were the massive overflow parking areas within which retreating American airmen were effectively trapped in one massive kill box, even to a point where an ad hoc relief force was literally sent from just off this map, literally, as this is the final battle map for the International Airport or Sunport. This extremely vital objective to the coalition for their establishment of a mega FOB was effectively the main terminal buildings, as well as the runways intact completely, which extend off this map to the south in both directions. As this area here was effectively the taxiways, which went around and connected right there, as this boulevard here is exactly this same one right here, wherein the end of the previous battle, the combat platoons of one of the 5 assembled armored infantry companies had moved into this area, and before this battle would begin, would spend 30 minutes logistically preparing and moving to this area here, where they would move south and effectively storm the main buildings of the International Sunport, or airport as it were. By this point in time, the Iranian big guns of their own artillery battalion of their M109A1 howitzers were preparing to fire in support of their forces, again in an extremely limited manner as it pertained to the overall number of fire missions they would fire, all of which being extremely precision-oriented, as it were, based on the ISR assets, such as the platoon-level drones, and they're effectively radioing in to the FDC forces of these artillery gun platoons that comprise the firing batteries, which comprise the whole battalion, the precise coordinates for strikes. And although one strike would be dangerously near the actual runway system on the taxiways, it would be easy to repair, as it would be literally just one shell vectored into one specific area. As also loitering munition strikes would be utilized from the Shahed 238 loitering munitions, as well as also the Pakistani mortars coming from the mortar company, effectively the fire support company of the mechanized infantry companies of Pakistani troops that still lingered in the area immediately to the east of the International Sunport or airport, as this was a bunch of different neighborhoods in the eastern portions of Albuquerque, which they were controlling via their different mechanized infantry companies, all of whom had split up and taken their positions in the area and had effectively locked down entry and exit from the east side of the city, as well as also still were in the area of the Kirtland Air Force Base's northern boundaries, and also patrolling the local neighborhoods as their fire support or a mortar company of their entire battalion, as they also had their headquarters and support company, effectively their logistical and command elements in the area. These forces would be effectively supporting the final Iranian push into the International Sunport or International Airport grounds, as the People's Armed Police forces of their 18th Light Armor Brigade were now moving up the highway and getting increasingly close to the city of Albuquerque, along with the 14th PLA Group Army, which would continue on north and out of the Albuquerque area, headed towards Colorado. The 18th PAP would move into the recent gains in the International Sunport and establish their command post within the International Airport main terminal building, as the Iranian headquarters battalion of their 3rd Armored Brigade, as well as also the headquarters company at the division level over the entire 18th ID of Pakistan, and even their support company at division level, would also likewise immediately move into these areas upon their successful capture by Iranian armored infantry forces, with a limited number of armor committed to this battle, as again, in the previous installment for the first push, one lone tank company had been committed to battle from this armored battalion moving north early on, and having had secured the flanks with these other battalions, including this armored infantry, clearing the south of the city, which was to become the future red zone for the colonial and economic exploitation activities of the CCP regime in the area, and now the grounds were being effectively laid for the megafob to be established. In fact, what would eventually become the largest megafob in the entire region as it pertained to New Mexico and some of its surrounding vicinity of neighboring states, as this area would encompass not only all of Kirtland and all of the International Sunport, but because it was adjacent to the south of the city, that would be the red zone, and all together would comprise the initial site for the colonial efforts of the CCP regime, led by the PAP 18th Light Armor Brigade, or 18th PAP for short, arriving in the area to lead the coalition forces already assembled from the Trojan Shock elements, which consisted of the 3rd Iranian Armored Brigade of their regular army and 18th Pakistani Infantry Division of their army, and the paramilitary People's Armed Police Forces would again lead all of these coalition forces in the occupation as well as counterinsurgency efforts that they knew they would have to fight upon the invasion's successful conclusion, as they were well aware through the use of the ISR assets that many armed Americans had fled the city, and even some had already taken to the mountains in the opening hours of the invasion itself. And now these forces working together to clear what was the last part of the city as a whole. It was still even in American hands, in the hands of these airmen that were even left, which was 185 of them, of the American forces in the area. Now, going to the battle map, the coalition air power returning, consisting of the PAFs, or Pakistani Air Forces, JF-17B Squadron, would commit to this battle, dropping their Baidu-guided munitions, as mentioned, on a very cautious given coordinate, which was effectively just outside of the actual runways, which these actually were the runways. While Iranian artillery would only fire one shell, 155 shell, at the taxiways that were literally just off the runways, and hit an American MRAP that was attempting to fire a tow missile that was mounted atop of it at the Iranian tanks, hence the only reason why the artillery had even been sanctioned in the first place to use in that area, and plus only one shell would be relatively easy to repair by the engineering forces that were to move in, both Chinese paramilitary and military forces, later after the battle had been, the victory in the battle had been achieved. And these areas of the taxiways would also likewise be hit by limited artillery, although a bit more than what would be utilized here. These areas were not seen as directly as important as was clearly the part that was near the runways themselves, and thus the artillery would be allowed a bit more liberally in these areas here and here, as these taxiways effectively wrapped around the building on two different sides, and would also likewise be repaired. The mortars were less of a problem, as these 81mm mortars were nowhere near as destructive as the 155 shells were, and all of this again would be repaired relatively quickly, as again the artillery use would still be limited, even though it was being used in a less important portion of the infrastructure, and still being used far enough away from the buildings that no damage would be done to these buildings to the point to where it was critical. As the Iranian armored infantry troops would be storming these buildings in force, 2 platoons would be committed to this exact effort, as one squad would clear this ancillary building slightly disconnected from the main structure, while the rest of this platoon's squads, effectively 3, would clear the main building, with this entire platoon's squads, 4 of which would go in. There were 52 defenders inside the main terminal building left, combined with what was outside of the building, including in these vehicles and dismounted, effectively equaled 185 total defenders, which included the gunners and drivers of vehicles, any mounted up personnel in the vehicles, the dismounts outside of the vehicles, and the personnel inside of the main terminal building structure. As now these forces were effectively retreating from the area, with the last of the American forces exiting the parking garage that was mentioned in this installment, where the ad hoc relief force had been slapped together literally just off this map to the slight south and east, having earlier had moved up this road here and fanned out to try to assist any of their forces that were located in this area here, which included the overflow parking, these hotels, and these buildings to the north, where forces had still been fighting at the time that the ad hoc relief effort was even launched. These forces had effectively been not just affected by the artillery strikes, but also by the tank-based fires, and were cut down in the process of trying to escape, while the rest were mortared, hit by loitering munition strikes, and even a limited amount of airstrikes from Baidu-guided munitions coming from the JH-7s that were streaking over the area rapidly and dropping these extremely precise payloads onto their targets below. And now, in this area, as Pakistani aircraft were returning just now at 8:45 a.m., as this battle would last until 10, or effectively an hour and 15 minutes, the armored infantry company that was in this area along the Airport Boulevard, the Sunport Boulevard effectively, while this was a separate company moving in from this direction, had continued to move into this area before then moving south. This company would move straight down into this area before effectively splitting up and fanning out to effectively block this area off in terms of their fields of fire from this particular area, while the company here had continued moving along this part of the Airport Boulevard and moved south, as they would basically pivot and then move this way, including one platoon going down this road here towards the parking garage and dismounting a squad to clear it after the last of the American forces was actually in the process of leaving at the time. And as these vehicles would stop right here and lay down fire, exchange fire very briefly with these American forces, their platoon-level quadcopter assets scouring the area, aided in the guidance of the now AI-guided Shahed 238 loitering munitions into their targets, as well as also the precision artillery fires and even the Pakistani mortar fire that came in from a single 81mm mortar strike. As now the forces were effectively fighting the last part of this campaign, the fighting would be of a very desperate but brutal nature as it pertained to American forces and putting up the best defenses they could inside the building, whereas outside they were picked apart by the combo of fires coming in from the armored infantry vehicles, their BMP-2s firing their Concours missiles and 30mm autocannon, not to mention their 7.62 by 54mm coax machine gun mounted beneath the 30, as well as also their Barragh APCs firing their 12.7mm machine gun fires, and then their dismounts, of course, firing their host of different anti-tank weapons, which ranged from the simple rocket-propelled grenade to the Kornet ATGMs, the Kornet anti-tank guided missiles, as it pertained to their anti-tank missiles besides their Concors as well. They also had the Concors, such as even those fired from the BMP-2s. Now, these forces were in the fight of their life as it pertained to the defending forces, and were trying, as earlier these forces had likewise fled from the parking garage, were trying to flee south and away from the advancing armored infantry troops moving into the area, who now cut them off and began to lay down fire into these vehicles, destroying two at the very opening of this map with Concors ATGMs and 30 mil fire, as the 30 would have been plenty on its own, but the ATGMs were utilized. This was the last phase of the fighting, and the Iranians knew it, the Americans knew it, so the fire was effectively let loose in full as a result of this. And the artillery strikes that were inbound hit here and here and here, while at the opening of the map, 4 different 155 strikes are hitting in this area right here, destroying the lead vehicle of this column of vehicles, of 4 vehicles, which was an up-armored Humvee with the Pararescue Elite Special Forces operatives contained within, while the follow-up vehicles were all Max Pro MRAPs and were about to be hit by loitering munition strikes, artillery fire, as well as fire coming from the vehicles of the armored infantry forces. As now, these vehicles were in the process of being destroyed by artillery, loitering munitions, and ground-based fires. These vehicles here, full of the Pararescue Elite Special Operatives, were likewise being hit by very surgically precise, yet destructive, Shahed 238s, which came screeching into these up-armored Humvees and blasting them into multiple pieces. As these vehicles here were also being engaged by the single committed tank company from one of 2 armored battalions that had earlier captured the Kirtland Air Base, moving northwest into the area to seize the runways intact and also block escape from American forces trying to flee the main buildings. Not that they would have had anywhere to go anyhow, as the last 2 of the armored infantry companies not committed to the overall airport capture operation of this armored infantry battalion, along with their headquarters and support companies, still sat outside of the International Airport grounds, or Sunport grounds, along with this entire battalion, minus only 1 of its 8 companies, which it had committed a single tank company into this battle, but still had 3 remaining tank companies, and its 2 armored infantry companies, an armored recon company, along with its headquarters and support company, also outside of the Sunport grounds to the east, with the 2 battalions minus 1 committed company, a tank company again, right here, holding the line to the east of the Sunport, whereas to the west was the remains of this armored infantry battalion, as just mentioned, as well as the nearly full armored battalion minus its 1 committed tank company. Now, as the Pakistani JF-17Bs returned into the area, they had dropped their Baidu-guided precision munitions, 2 each, right on the edges of the runway, not on the runway itself, but on the ground, on the earth that was immediately off of the runway proper, thereby not doing any immediate destruction to the runway as a whole, and still being able to destroy these 2 fleeing MRAPs by the time they got here, as the blast radius was enough to destroy both. As similar happened here, as these 4 vehicles were fleeing the area after this up-armored Humvee took a tank shell from this tank before it reoriented its firepower, and this tank even fired over here, destroying this MRAP as other tanks destroyed these from here before reshifting their fire to cut down these forces with their remote control heavy machine gun turret mounts, not to mention also their turret gunners and coax machine guns, which each single tank enabled them to lay down an enormous volume of machine gun fires from one single vehicle. These forces were trying to fall back into the buildings themselves, and as a result, this half squad turned around to face the Iranian armor and was firing at them, and it even fired an AT-4, as by this point they were nearly out of anti-tank missiles entirely, and these personnel had none other than any AT-4s, which were one-time use disposable anti-armor weapons that were not capable of penetrating the armor of the Karar main battle tanks in battle, and would be destroyed as they turned around and began to try to lay down fire. These tanks simply just cut them down. As these forces fled into the building, they lost many of their personnel, with only 2 making it inside alive, as the other 3, as running as fast as they could, were still cut down by the hail of fire from the tanks firing their machine guns, which were the only weapons sanctioned for use against the actual building proper also. Although a lone 155 shell had effectively been vectored in to the area here, again, on this taxiway to destroy this vehicle, which did have an anti-tank guided missile aboard mounted on its roof. This Max Pro MRAP with a tow missile on top of it was destroyed at the opening of the map. As mortars struck in the middle of the runways and taxiways here on the earth, on the dirt, they blasted these personnel right here as the 81 millimeter mortars were vectored in, as the ISR system effectively informed their fire direction personnel where exactly to direct the mortar strikes, which landed and destroyed these forces right here. And now, as these munitions were dropped and had destroyed these 4 vehicles, which the furthest the lead vehicle got was here, but the blast radius still caught it from behind and effectively flipped it over and destroyed it, as the rest were hit directly by the munitions and didn't get very far onto the runway at all, as the munitions landed in the earth just adjacent. The area was now completely clear for the clearance of the buildings, as these forces were already in progress of entering at the opening of the map and had stacked along the entryways and were effectively in battle already with the forces inside that were firing out at them. Hence these arrows all have green around the edges of them. And the Iranians would take casualties in order to clear this entire structure. It would be a harsh battle inside, as these vehicles were destroyed by the fire coming from the combo of Barak APCs, as well as the lead IFV having fired its Concours missiles, as the Baraks fired their heavy machine guns at the dismounted personnel, trying to effectively use them as cover as they rolled out of the parking garage and were rapidly destroyed as a result, as mortar fire came in again and decimated these personnel, along with artillery strikes here, and which destroyed this vehicle, as well as an artillery shell destroyed this MRAP, along with also the loitering munitions. 3 different systems were utilized to destroy these personnel, from the mortar to the artillery and the loitering munition strikes, along with even also, in addition to these systems, the ground-based fires that was effectively short-traded with these forces between one another, as well as a very short trade of fire had effectively been undertaken, but was resolved exceedingly fast between these forces. Over in this area, these forces, these two vehicles, again, were destroyed at the opening from the ground-based and artillery strikes, all coming in and decimating these vehicles, with the artillery especially, and of course a loitering munition strike as mortars came in and got these personnel that were on the taxiway and adjacent to it, trying to get inside of the building and never made it. Now that the fighting effectively was narrowed down to the fighting occurring to take over the main buildings, the 52 defenders inside, as the outside fighting effectively was a 15-minute long affair, while the fighting going on within, now that the building was thoroughly and completely surrounded at this point, as the armor had fields of fire that covered all directions, and also, of course, when combined with the armored infantry forces in the area as well, there was no escape. And now, effectively, the fighting would take an hour to clear this entire building of all of its defending personnel, as fighting would rage in the rather open areas, as well as also the more narrow hallways, offices, closets. Everything inside of this building would be fought over, as the terminals, the shopping areas, the standard offices, and other structures one would find within a building of this type would be fought over by the Iranian forces and the American defenders, as the Iranians would go room by room, open terminal by open terminal, hall by hall, office by office, closet by closet, if need be. And the Iranians inside would lose 2 full squads of their personnel out of all 7 that went into the building. 3 from this platoon, as 1 went in and cleared this building alone, the small building just detached from the main structure, while 7 went into this building. 2 would be lost, and only 8 prisoners would be taken POW, as that would be all effectively left, as most opted not to surrender and to go down fighting, and the 8 POWs taken needed critical medical attention, which they would receive from Iranian combat medics rushing on scene, not only to treat their own forces, as not only had they lost 2 full squads of troops trying to take this building, or effectively 20 troops, but they also had a number of wounded as well, a few critically, but they had effectively had 2.5 squads that were wounded in some capacity. Most of them being hits in the extremities, of course, and 1 with a critical head wound, and another having had bled out critically but was saved in time before it became too critical for them and too much blood loss. And the POWs were removed, and the Iranians would do several security sweeps just to ensure that they had fully captured the facility, and they would raise the Iranian flag on top of the building upon going onto the roof to show the ISR assets that the building had been thoroughly captured, as they had taken it. And now it was 10 a.m., by which point the other coalition forces, namely the Chinese external component forces, which included the People's Armed Police, 18th Light Armor Brigade, as well as, of course, their 14th PLA Group Army, which would continue moving up the highway, were now just beginning to get into the AO, and the People's Armed Police would be arriving very shortly, as they had made good time and only had to travel the shortest distance out of all 4 major invasion prongs in the south central invasion sector, which included effectively all of Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. As the Texas state was the vast majority of the south central invasion sector, the prongs through Texas, a far more heavily populated state with even more critical infrastructure within it to the Americans, involved 3 enormous invasion prongs, whereas the invasion prong moving through New Mexico, although New Mexico still possessed some critical assets to America, such as the underground nuclear storage and maintenance facilities below the Kirtland Air Force Base, as well as the Los Alamos National Labs, which the Russians had captured in their area of operations, and a few others. The 14th PLA Group Army would continue north and into the Colorado sector of the invasion, and would assist in the Battle of Denver, one of the last battles in the invasion, as Denver was very deep inland, and the externals rushing in from both Canada and Mexico, fanning out in the middle of the country, would meet in the center states, predominantly of Colorado, Kansas, and Missouri, where they would assist the local Trojan forces in capturing the last objectives of the invasions between days 3 and 4, predominantly, as most of the nation would fall within the first 2 days of the invasion. Days 3 and 4 were effectively a massive mop-up operation, and the last major battles, besides a few scattered, isolated large cities on the periphery of the nation, such as the Cap City battle itself and a few others, the battles in the innermost 3 states would be some of the last to occur in the entire invasion, as the rest of the nation would fall again exceedingly fast, exceedingly rapid. And now the city of Albuquerque, its entire area of operations within this 30-mile north-south by 15-mile east-west area, had been fully captured by the coalition. However, there would only be a short lull in the fighting, meaning a brief pause in the actual battle, as it was not even over just yet. While the coalition had assumed it was over, the Americans had different ideas, as there was a large militia force that was outside of the area of operations a bit to the south, where there were no coalition forces yet, because this area of operations and their 18th Pakistani Infantry Division, 3rd Iranian Armored Brigade of their regular army, and now the arriving 18th People's Armed Police, or their 18th PAP Light Armor Brigade, would be responsible for moving out from this area and pressing outward in terms of patrols and establishing checkpoints, as well as also establishing combat outposts and basing troops further out and away from this area of operations, as they would expand into the tertiary areas which had not yet been totally subdued and conquered. Although this area of operations had been, again, to the south, to the west, and for now to the east even as well, the tertiary areas had not been, as of yet, just for the moment taken, as it was still day 1 in the invasion. By late afternoon, or hour 20, effectively, the Battle of Albuquerque would only then officially come to an end, after the Americans had initiated the last part of this battle, as a much better organized American militia-type force comparatively with those that were partaking in the battle in Albuquerque in earlier hours, would, after receiving information about Iranian artillery positions on their CCP regime property, which was actually extremely nearby to I-25, as refugees fled to the south, as others fled north, east, and west as well. The refugees fleeing southbound had effectively informed these militia-type forces, as they had effectively passed some of them while they were fleeing on these tertiary roads near the interstate, that the invasion forces, as they were not sure what nationality they even were firing artillery from a property near the interstate, as again, they were fleeing on tertiary routes that were not necessarily on or adjacent to the highway, but a bit out and away from them, and they were generally left alone for the time being because there were more pressing issues, such as taking control of this key node known as Albuquerque and Kirtland Air Force Base. As refugees were seen at the moment, as this battle was going on, as the absolute lowest priority of all, effectively not even a priority at that moment, they were left alone as they were seen fleeing the city, as the Iranians and Pakistani forces were drastically more concerned with the absolute total control of the Interstate 25 especially, but also to a lesser extent the I-40 corridor for east-west logistics and travel, including the last remaining intact river crossings, and of course, the International Sunport, most of all, along with the Kirtland Air Force Base, although it could be said that I-25 was an extremely close priority with these other two priorities, as well as the red zone even as well. So the capture of the city was absolute top priority. Even the armed refugees fleeing into the mountains that were not reactionary armed civilians, but armed civilians fleeing the area, ostensibly at first as refugees, but would later come under the tutelage of the last remaining absolute military elements even in this region, which would be the pararescue forces, effectively two companies in total strength in terms of their size and numbers. They would take these armed civilians that fled into the Sandia Mountains, Cibola National Wilderness or Forest, under their wing, train them, develop and cultivate them and their skills, and organize them and work on their logistical preps to turn them into a very effective partisan insurgent group to wield against the local occupation forces of Pakistanis, Iranians, and of course the People's Armed Police paramilitary forces of their light armor brigade, the 18th, moving into this area, which would effectively also be taking over the entire efforts of both in counterinsurgency warfare, but also in occupation, and preparing the way for the arrival of Chinese colonists, as they were the vanguard of the entire paramilitary forces of China, and they were seen as the elite of the elite, as the CCP regime's Praetorian Guard forces, similar to the Waffen-SS of World War II fame, and also other historical and even contemporary heavily armed paramilitary type elements. The People's Armed Police would carry out the edicts of the party to the letter, and this would include the efforts that were set to occur within the Albuquerque area of operations. As the hours would effectively go by, as these refugees again had informed the militiamen to the south of what had been going on, not just in the city itself, but also what they had seen in passing with the Iranian artillery forces on their pre-prepared CCP regime firing points on their property, firing in support of the entire operation as they fled south. These forces had put a battle plan together in the hours in between when they'd been notified effectively very early on and when they would launch their attack, as they would need to move north into the Albuquerque AO as a whole and launch this attack. This attack would effectively take place between hours 19 and 20 of the overall entire nationwide invasion on day one on October 4th, late afternoon of the entire invasion as a whole. As the forces of the People's Armed Police by then will have already arrived in theater and would even be contributing a small force to the relief effort of the Iranian forces. Not that they would need it, because the air power of the coalition being supplied alone in the form of the extremely powerful JH-7s especially, but also the Pakistani air power of the JF-17Bs, which were a highly advanced and capable not only air superiority fighter aircraft, but multi-role strike aircraft as well. And even Pakistani Air Force Mirage 5s would all contribute to the outright utter annihilation, as the airport will have been captured already long ago and PAP forces moving into it, to the overall destruction of this militia-type force, along with the artillery forces fighting in their own defense, receiving enormous loitering munition support from their own headquarters and support battalion over their whole 3rd Armored Brigade, which, along with the SHORAD forces, would be moving into the area to effectively move on to the CCP regime property to receive their fueling, as there was a major store of fuel on this site, before their vehicles and personnel would then proceed into the International Sunporter Airport, where again they would be moving in with the Pakistani forces of their division level headquarters company and support company into their new command installations on the new soon-to-be mega FOB, along with the People's Armed Police headquarters battalion over their entire 18th Light Armor Brigade as well, which was moving again into the airport buildings proper. This battle will be covered in the next and last video of the Albuquerque AO sub-component or battle, effectively, of the larger South Central invasion sector during the wider nationwide 4th generation warfare doctrine invasion of America.